Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, longtime listeners of Bloomberg Businessweek and Bloomberg Radio know our next guest, well, or at least his voice, very well, because for years he's graced our airwaves. But it's not just Bloomberg Radio. Ed Kalegi, who is a Bloomberg News reporter, is also the host of the nationally syndicated radio show, The Weekend with Ed Kalegi. It airs on AM and FM stations across the U.S. every week. He's also the author of a new book. It's out November 18th. It's called It Was Great to Say Hello To. A curious radio host's conversations with actors, authors, and newsmakers. Ed Kalegi joins us from New Jersey. Ed, welcome back to Business Week. We're talking Carol Burnett, Brooke Shields, Chaz Palminteri, Doris Kearns-Goodwin, Mitch McConnell. The list goes on and on. We'll get to some of the big names you've interviewed over the years. But first, you've got a great story in your path to radio. It hasn't been straight. It's been pretty circuitous.
No.
How did you get into it?
I started as a kid in New Jersey, Tim, and it is great to join you and Jess this afternoon. This one is very special for me to be here this afternoon. When I was 5, 6, 7 years old, I was just infatuated with all things radio and all things conversational television. I was the only 6-year-old kid in my neighborhood who had like a 5-inch Sony black and white TV, and I would watch Dick Cavett at night through a snowy picture that wouldn't hold steady for me. But there was something just so magical about radio and television, and I had the bug from a very early age. And when you have something like that within you, it's very hard to shake it. So it has been a very interesting journey, but fortunately, things have worked out pretty well.
And you brought up, obviously, when it comes to Dick Cavett, because one of Word on the Street, one of our producers was telling us, and you kind of alluded to it, how you kind of would walk around with those walkie-talkies, and it kind of gave you those ideas. But what was it about that kind of business that really fascinated you, where you kind of had this bigger dreams of what you wanted to aspire to?
Jess, you mentioned the walkie-talkie. That was my first radio station. When I was like 8 or 9 years old, my parents gave me a set of those Radio Shack, like 995 walkie-talkies. I threw one away. I kept one, put the 9-volt battery in, taped down the transmit button. So boom, all of a sudden, I got myself a transmitter and I'm on the air. And I was playing music and reading commercials and doing the news and the sports and everything. But when it comes to somebody like Cavett, I saw someone who had the magic triple touch. He had wit, he had intelligence, and he had sophistication. And if you have all three of those things, you're doing pretty good for yourself. And I just found his way to not just talk to people, but converse with them and learn about them. And that stuck with me so much. And when I was first very fortunate to get this show 10 years ago, I was assigned an intern. And they said, who do you want to have on the show? And I figured, what the heck? Aim big. I'm thinking, is he going to come on this brand new show? Little old me. He doesn't know who I am. They reached out to the New York Times, where at that point, Cavett was writing a column. And I find out 2 days later, he'll come on and he'll talk to you. And about a week later, I was as nervous as could be. I was supposed to have 10 minutes with Dick Cavett on my show. It turned into an hour. And it is perhaps the most memorable hour I have ever had, not just in my career, but in my entire life. And he was so gracious and so kind. And from that point there, I realized I was in the zone and doing exactly what I was meant to do.
That's so great to hear, Ed. And I wonder, too, about just right now what it's like. You know, you spent so many years asking people questions and leading these discussions. As this book comes out, you're now the one doing the media tour. You're on the other side of the microphone. What's that like?
It's weird because I'm used to ending every phrase in an inflective tone. You can't do it this way. I'm on the other side of the prism here. You know, it's through the looking glass, and here I am looking back at you. But it's interesting because I get to see what it's like from the other side, and it just shows me how important not just asking questions is, but listening and having a great conversation. And Tim, you get this because you do this every day with Carol. You have important conversations with people and you explore and you learn more. So no matter what side of the conversation you're on, I always thought that listening was more important than talking. And that's kind of how I've led my way through all of this.
And Ed, of course, Tim was just mentioning different people you have been able to have the pleasure of interviewing over the years, from Carol Burnett, Dick Van Dyke, Henry Winkler. Also, I think outside of that realm, you've talked to politicians like Mitch McConnell. What are some of the kind of the most fascinating things you've heard from some of these figures, whether they are in Hollywood or not?
Well, it's interesting you bring up Mitch McConnell. He had a book out a few years ago. It was his memoir, and so he's booked on the show. So, Jess, I'm thinking, okay, we're going to talk politics and all that, but I really didn't want to do that because I don't do that type of thing. I want to learn more about the person. And we ended up going someplace I never thought we would go. He started sharing with me that the most trouble he ever got into when he was a kid was when he was 13 years old. He was living down south, but he was a big baseball fan of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And they were having the wake in the house for his uncle in the kitchen or in some other room in the house. But Mitch sneaks away, and all of a sudden, Mitch's dad is wondering, where's Mitch in a very important time here for our family? Mitch sneaks into the living room, and he's cowering behind the couch, and he has his ear pressed up against the big, giant old radio they had, and he was listening to the Brooklyn Dodgers play the New York Yankees in the 1955 World Series. And at that point, he was Senate Majority Leader. I didn't think he would be admitting to me how he got in trouble when he was 13 years old because he snuck off to listen to a ball game when he should have been at his uncle's wake. So sometimes the conversations go places that you don't know they're going to go there. But it's a wonderful thing. These conversations just turn into these organic experiences that kind of have lives of their own. And to me, that's the best conversation of all.
One thing I think a lot about when I do radio is how much I love the medium and the idea of, I used to do a lot of TV and more TV. And we still do TV, but it's a little different. And the conversation, I feel like, is a lot different than you have with somebody when you're on TV. And I'm wondering how you think about the medium here.
You are exactly right. Radio is the most intimate of all media. Because when I'm on the air, and it doesn't matter what I'm doing, be it my show or when I used to do the traffic or now when I do news on Bloomberg, I don't think I'm talking to a group of people. I'm talking to one person. My audience is one person who is listening to me at that very moment. And there is a wonderful intimacy with that because radio, and even now audio, because radio is morphing into something different and I think even more wonderful. Audio is different because you're with people anywhere and everywhere. You're with them as they're lying in bed at night and they can't sleep. You're with them in the car. You're with them as they're on the subway now and they might be listening to a podcast. You're with them in very special ways. You don't get that through television. The wonderful audio medium is the only platform we have for that one-to-one communication. And Tim, you're right. There is something very special and very magical about what radio is, but whatever radio becomes, that magic is always going to be there, and it won't leave anytime soon.
When you're discussing some of these intimate conversations with these people, what's kind of the feedback you hear from your listeners and different takeaways or maybe different lessons they learned from people that they were able to use maybe in their everyday lives?
It's interesting you say that, Jess. I had, and to me, this was just a fun one. When I was growing up in New York, or in New Jersey, there was a kid show on called the News Review. And about a year ago, I got a message from a publicist, would you like to have Doug and Emmy Joe on from the News Review? And I said, sure. I mean, they were quite the thing for me when I was 8 years old. But we had a nice conversation. And when it was finished, I received an email from a listener. And they said to me that you brought back the one happy memory I had as a child because that show was my oasis and it was my escape. I grew up in an abusive situation, and the only thing that got me through it was watching that show. And when I heard those people again, it brought me back to a time, and I realized that was the only thing that helped me survive to this day. And that really hit me because it showed me that for me, a moment that was just fun and just some throwaway conversation meant something very ethereal to somebody else. And it shows that maybe in a tiny little way, what I do makes a little difference, at least for someone. And it was just a wonderful response.
Hey, Ed, how do you think about technology and the shifting way that people are getting audio? Because these smartphones were supposed to kind of kill traditional, in quotes, traditional radio. And I think what is so interesting right now is that you have people listening more than they've listened in a very long time because of podcasting. And you saw that play out during the presidential election, how important it was for these candidates to get on some of these podcasts. What do you make of what's going on in the audio ecosystem?
I think it's important, and it's funny how you bring up the smartphone. The smartphone for us today is what the transistor radio was for a teenager back in 1965. It was transformative. And I think the traditionalists that only want to call radio, they're starting to come around and realize that we're opening up doors to find new audiences, younger demographics. We're able to do different things. I think the idea that someone can listen to an interview that I did with someone at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday or 4:15 in the afternoon on a Friday, I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think for anyone that creates content, and there's the new word of the moment, I think it's wonderful because the ecosystem is changing, but it's expanding. And it's bringing many more people in, and it's giving voice to people that wouldn't have those voices in the first place. Think about it, Tim. When it came to the radio spectrum, you were limited to the amount of stations in a market and the amount of hours in a day. When it comes to the podcast landscape, it is completely unlimited. So any opinion, any voice can now be heard, and someone who was searching for anything to listen to, they can now find that. I think that's a wonderful thing.
It's pretty incredible to see. I mean, somebody like Howard Stern 25 years ago, the power that he had versus, what someone like Joe Rogan has today with his podcast on YouTube, Spotify. And the like, hey, Ed, sit tight. We're going to do some news. I know you know all about that, and we are going to come back. We're going to talk about some of those folks who you've interviewed over the years because your book is just chock full of them. Ed Kalegi is the author of the new book. It comes out in just a couple of days. It's called It Was Great to Say Hello To, a curious radio host conversations with actors, authors, and newsmakers. More with Ed Kalegi when we return. I want to get right back to Ed Kalegi. He's a Bloomberg News reporter. He is also the host of the nationally syndicated radio show, The Weekend with Ed Kalegi. It airs on AM and FM stations across the U.S. He's got a new book out on November 18th. It's called It Was Great to Say Hello To, a curious radio host conversations with actors, authors, and newsmakers. And Ed, that's exactly where I want to go now. You mentioned your Mitch McConnell interview from a few years back, but the book is chock full of huge names. I mentioned some of them, including Brooke Shields, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Carol Burnett. Give us a memorable conversation and why it was memorable.
I had Cassidy Hutchinson on about a year ago when her book Enough hit the stands, and she had done a tremendous amount of media at that point, Tim. So I'm thinking, I don't know where we're going to go to find anything different. But
remind everyone who she is.
Well, Cassidy Hutchinson was in the Trump administration, and she was called in front of the January 6th committee, and she had some of the most interesting and damning testimony in front of that committee. And it is someone who did not expect to be in that position. So when we were talking, and she was talking about how she had worked directly for Mark Meadows, and she said more than anything else, how she was just so let down and so disappointed. And it's fascinating when you can speak to someone and you can hear in their voice such emotion. And it sometimes the emotion speaks more than the words do. I had Rosanna Arquette on, and we started talking about the Me Too movement. And she started talking about her experiences with Harvey Weinstein. And she became just very emotional in our conversation. So sometimes the words don't mean as much as the emotions that come with the words do. And it amplifies just how important some of these conversations are and just how meaningful they have been for me as well. We've tried to have people on from all different spectrums. We've had actors, and we have authors of best-selling books, and they all have interesting stories. And some people come on and they're just wonderfully nice. Henry Winkler, the nicest guy in the world. And for a kid in New Jersey that grew up in the 70s, the idea that I got to have the Fonz on the show, it's like, pinch me. But it's interesting because everybody comes with their own story. And I guess I always feel that it's my job to just try to bring that story out and to try to just elicit some emotion and just elicit some deep meaning in the conversation, even if it is just with an actor talking about a TV show. There's always something that can be gleaned from every conversation.
I love that he brought up Jess, Henry Winkler, because if obviously the Fonz,
Right.
very important to a lot of people, but
Iconic.
even
Fonz.
now, the show Barry,
That's right.
his role as show
Yes.
Barry was such an incredible part that he played. I mean, he's still got it.
Somebody I've always really loved, Perry Gilpin. So she was Roz on Frasier, one of my favorite sitcoms in the 90s. And it's interesting, too, because Lisa Kudrow, of course, who famously was Phoebe on Friends, was originally supposed to do that role. It didn't work out.
That's right.
And then she ended up having, and then, of course, she didn't know Friends was coming along the way, and it did. But talk to us more about Perry in that moment, because then this became a huge moment for her as well.
Well, it's interesting because, everybody talks to Perry about Frasier and that. I started to dig deeper. I surprised her when I talked to her knowing that I knew about her father's radio career in Philadelphia.
I love
Her
that.
father was a guy named Jim O'Brien, who was this huge star in Philadelphia. He was an AM radio disc jockey. He was doing the weather on the news at night. He had like 19 different jobs at one time. And she was shocked that I brought that up. But Perry came on to talk about the work that she was doing in a tiny YouTube show at the moment called Old Guy. And it was fascinating to me because here's a woman that was on this iconic show, and everybody knows who she is. Everybody knows who the character of Roz is. But she was all excited to talk about these tiny little YouTube episodes she was doing at that point. And it proved to me that an actor just loves their craft so much. And again, it's a place I didn't think we would go. She was shocked when I brought up the fact that she did a bunch of voiceovers on King of the Hill, which was one of my favorite shows. So the more you know about somebody when you lead into a conversation, it really kind of prepares where you can go with these people. And I love to shock some of these actors. Like, I remember when you did this. I always like to dig up their IMDb.
Love it.
And I scroll so much all the way back to the beginning. It's like, with some of these people, you can get carpal tunnel syndrome by scrolling so far back. I bring up the first thing they did and I ask if they remember it. And a lot of times they're shocked and kind of appreciative that you kind of dig that far back to know that much about them.
Ed, how do you write a book like this? Over, with interviews that you've done years ago. Do you take notes after you do these interviews? Like, did you know you were going to write a book like this?
It's interesting you bring that up, Tim. What happened was about 2 years ago, there's a woman in Washington. Her name is Diane Nine. Proudly, she is now my literary agent. She used to give me a lot of, still does, great guests for my show. We had a conversation one day. What am I going to do with these 1,000 recordings of all of these interviews? And so I said, well, maybe I can write about them. At first, this was just going to be transcriptions. Ed said this, the person said this, back and forth, which has worked great for some people. She said, don't do that. Reflect on them and write about them. And it made the book, or the writing of the book, take 2 years rather than about a year. But it was the greatest advice anyone has ever given to me because I learned much about myself and how much I enjoy doing what I do now. And 80,000 words later, here it is. And I don't know if I could do it again, but the experience was incredible. I never thought I could write a book. And fortunately, I had all of this great material to kind of pull from. And it really just reinforced to me just how great it is for me to be able to do what I've always wanted to do.
And I know this is something Tim really was interested in gleaning more information on, but who do you want to talk to but haven't talked to yet?
David Letterman.
Oh,
David
that'd be a good
Letterman.
one.
I am such a fan of late night television. I love Cavett. I love Carson. I love Letterman. That is someone I could sit and talk to for hours because David Letterman was a broadcaster first and an entertainer second. And I think that is what made him as great as he still is to this day. And that is one person I would love to sit down and have a conversation with.
Hey, just call the folks over at Netflix because he's got that great Netflix show too. Hey, before we let you go, we got 30 seconds left. Your son is following in your footsteps. This is really cool.
Thank you. I am so glad you said that. My son is a senior at Rutgers University, and he wants to be a sports announcer. When he was a kid, he would put his video games on and put them into autoplay mode, and he would sit in his room and do play-by-play at 6 and 7 years old. He is the sports director at WRSU in New Brunswick. Tonight, he will be doing the Rutgers game on radio. He is working professionally doing television now as well. He is my pride and joy, and it just makes me so incredibly happy to see where his journey may take him. I appreciate you bringing Eddie up. So thank you, Tim. That's great.
Ed, we love hearing from you. Love seeing you around the office also. Ed Kalegi, He's got the new book out. It was great to say hello to. A Curious Radio Host, Conversations with Actors, Authors, and Newsmakers. You can pre-order it now. It's out on November 18th. He's a Bloomberg News reporter, and he's also the host of the nationally syndicated radio show, The Weekend with Ed Kalegi. This is Business Week.